who is Santiago Brand? So Santiago is now located, living in Bogota, Colombia. So who is it? Who is he? He is a sport and clinical psychologist, a brain spotter trainer for Colombia, specialist in QEEG brain mapping, biofeedback, and neurofeedback, also heart rate variability biofeedback. And he also acts as clinical director of brand neurofeedback, vice president of SciTech Bioscience, scientific advisor for Minerva, neuroscience and neurofeedback program consultant at EduFake and Psychotherapy Trauma Institute, and also co-author of The Power of Brainspotting, the international anthology. This is the book. I hope you can see it. Wait, can you see it? The Power of Brainspotting here. Yes, this is the book, The Power of Brainspotting. So he is also the co-author. The title is Brainspotting, QEEG, Biofeedback, and Neurofeedback Towards an Integrative Approach to Trauma Healing and Regulations. So we are going to talk probably about those. And without further ado, I think it's enough from me. Please help us with your microphone mute. And without further ado, I welcome Santiago. Please, Santiago.
Hello, good morning from South America and the US, and good evening to all of those in Indonesia, and good afternoon to all of those watching us from Europe. I want to thank Brainspotting Indonesia for this initiative and for having me here today, talking about the brain trauma and brain spotting, something that we've been working on for a couple of months now, and now it's a reality. So I'm very, very, very excited to be here today. I'm very excited to be able to share some of my knowledge with you today in talking about trauma from a brain perspective, and not so much from a neuroanatomical perspective, but from a psychophysiological perspective, and also from a neurophysiological perspective. So we will see some brain maps and some psychophysiological recordings of trauma and the brain, and we will be able to share some of the things that we found with the preliminary research we've done as well. And what I'm going to do now is share my screen here. And I do hope you can see it. If you cannot see it, please let me know. So as I was saying, we will talk about trauma, the brain, and brain spotting from a psychophysiological and neurophysiological perspective. I have been doing neurofeedback, biofeedback, and QEEG brain mapping for the past 12 years. And I am absolutely interested and passionate about the brain, brain activity, and what trauma does to the brain, and how we can integrate brain spotting with other techniques to help people heal. So that's what we're going to talk about today. That's some of the things I'm going to share today about my experience and some of the brain spotting recordings we've done. As always, I'd like to start my presentations with this statement by Peter Levine from his book, Waking the Tiger. And there's two things that come to mind when we talk about trauma, and in my experience in working with trauma and trauma survivors. One is that people who come see us often think they're crazy because their symptoms are so overwhelming that they think they're losing their minds or they're going crazy. And I'd like to explain to them that there's a rational explanation for what's going on, what's happening to them. Many clients will come see us not for something not necessarily directly related to trauma, but symptoms or behaviors that will be related to trauma or traumas they have experienced in the past. And when I talk about brain mapping, when we look at their brain activity, and when we talk about brain spotting, my job is to explain to them that something rational is going on, that there's nothing hidden or unexplained happening, that most of the time we're going to be able to explain what's going on in their minds, And hence, that's where they're behaving, thinking, or acting, or feeling in a certain way. Now, this is the definition of trauma from the American Psychological Association, from their website. And the thing that I want to highlight here is that some people have difficulty moving on with their lives. So clients who come see me are clients who have tried everything that you can think of, from pharmacology to psychotherapy to other approaches, and nothing seems to have worked for them. And I explain to them about the nervous system and how their nervous system is not flexible enough to be able to accept those changes, and how unprocessed trauma or unprocessed traumatic experiences have to do with why they're feeling stuck in their lives. So we help people move on. We help people reprocess the trauma, renegotiate the trauma, and then they can be healthier and happier. And this pyramid here is from the CDC and the Kaiser Permanente study, which you can find on Google. But what my main interest is when we have the disrupted neurodevelopment, because that's in my line of work what I look at when a client comes sees me. And it's what I look at when I do a stress profile, when I do a brain map, and when I do a neurophysiological assessment. These are the things that will jump to the forefront, and I will look at, because I'm interested in seeing how trauma dysregulates brain functioning, brain connectivity, brain wiring, and therefore how that disruption and that dysregulation in our connectivity, in our wiring, will disrupt our well-being and will make us act or think or feel a certain way. So we're dysregulated, and we want to go to regulation by looking at that precisely and specifically. Now, we also work with the Hpa axis, and for those of you who are not familiar with this is the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis. And it's very important in trauma and chronic stress, because every time we are traumatized, and the trauma response and the subsequent stress we experience from the initial trauma will trigger this axis. And it will trigger a chemical response that can make us sick and can affect our mental and physical health greatly, hindering our well-being, hindering our happiness, hindering our performance. So it's gonna make us behave in ways in which we don't want, think in ways in which we don't want, and feel in ways in which we don't want. And what usually happens is that you have your hypothalamus as the center of the storm, and it will release certain hormones that will go to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will secrete other specific hormones, and then it will go to the adrenal glands, which are located on top of the kidneys. Now, the main hormone here is going to be cortisol, and cortisol will have to do a lot with the trauma response and chronic stress. When we address trauma from a brain spotting perspective, when we intervene with brain spotting or we intervene with biofeedback and neurofeedback, we are intervening partly and greatly with the Hpa axis. And what we're doing is taking somebody who's dysregulated, who either has too much cortisol or has no cortisol at all, and we help them to center and self-regulate. So we don't have somebody being hypervigilant or dissociating or going into constriction all the time, or somebody who's helpless and hopeless. We empower them and we get them healthier and happier and more functional. So even though they may remember the trauma, they're no longer activated. Their arousal is no longer going up as a consequence of that. And so they can think about it without being, feeling sad or going into depression or wanting to hurt themselves. And that's what we want to do with these interventions. Now, as you all know, because of your experience in trauma and brain spotting, there's different kinds of trauma that go from the time where, our moms are pregnant with us. So traumas can be prenatal or pre-verbal, before we're even born, or before we're even, we know how to talk, we learn how to talk. And I'm not going to stop a lot here because you've probably heard David and others in the field talk about this, and you talk about this with your clients. Now, I wanna draw a close relationship, a close correlation between the 4 elements of trauma and how we see them in the brain map and in stress profiles. So with brain mapping technology, we have the ability to correlate hyperarousal, constriction, dissociation, and helplessness with certain brainwave patterns that can help us decide, or in my case, help me decide what the best brain spotting approach is. If I have somebody with hyperarousal, I usually start with a resourcing spot. So I use resourcing instead of activation. If I have somebody who is mixed, I do 2 brain spots. I do a brain spot, one which is activating, one which is resourcing and relaxing. So depending on the brainwave pattern, I've been able to sort of, hone my skills and optimize my craft when it comes to brain spotting interventions. And this information might be useful to you as well. So we know what hyperarousal is. We have high sympathetic activation, the branch of the autonomic nervous system that will kick in the fight or flight response. Our first option is always to flee, to escape, to get away, to move away from that threat. If we're not able to do so, our next option is to fight with all our might to survive. And there's a third option, which is the freezing response, and we get into helplessness. And we can see brainwave patterns associated with that and psychophysiological patterns that are associated to that. And I will talk about those in further detail later on in the talk. But by near observation, we can tell when a client is hypervigilant. They sweat a lot, they have cold hands and cold feet, their breathing is shallow and fast, they have running, pervasive, and intrusive thoughts that it's hard for them to get rid of. They are constantly on the lookout. They might be more prone to aggression, whether it's physical or verbal or both. So we observe certain things that lead us to believe that hypervigilance might be, or hyperarousal might be the most salient of those components. Now, we know that the 4 components are going to be present in a person who's been traumatized. So people who experience hyperarousal, constriction, dissociation, and helplessness. The most important thing here is to understand that 1 or 2 are going to be often more salient for different people. Different people process trauma differently. They react to trauma differently. So for most people, dissociation will be the most salient presentation. For other people, the most salient presentation will be hypervigilance. Others will feel helplessness as the most pervasive of the elements. And what I try to do in my work is again, draw a close correlation with brainwave patterns and these elements, so we can better understand how we can make the brain more flexible and how we can go from dysregulation to regulation to help the client heal more properly and more optimally. And in constriction, we have homeostasis and allostasis. So homeostasis is going to that point of equilibrium, balance, happiness, well-being, joy, whatever you want to call it. And allostasis, it's when you involve every resource, whether it's mental or physical, to combat that stress. So in constriction, when people suppress, they're using that suppression as a way of trying to break away from the agony, the physical, emotional, and psychological agony of the trauma response. The problem is that, as David Grant calls it, it becomes a non-useful homeostasis. So people, in trying to balance out, they're getting the opposite result. And with brain spotting plus other techniques, we bring that self-regulation. And dissociation is a common one. We often see it in clients who tend to be hypervigilant and use dissociation as a way to space out, as a way to escape the world of depression and anxiety and pain, whether it's physical or mental. And I have been able to, in my brief work with brain spotting and EEG, I identified some brainwave patterns that strongly correlate with dissociation. So I'm able to see in someone's brain activity if dissociation is their preference method of coping with trauma. And the specific characteristics of dissociation is the person spaces out. They feel that they're going into a different dimension. They feel they're observing the world from a different perspective, and often they understand what's happening. More often they don't understand what is happening. And so we try to understand that from a brain perspective to see how we can make brain spotting an even more powerful, profound, and meaningful healing experience for that individual. Now, helplessness is probably the most common one. It's, people come to see us more often than not as a last resource. At least that's my experience. People come and tell me, I've tried pharmacology, I've tried angel reading, I've tried coaching, I've tried meditation, I've tried ayahuasca, I've tried everything you can think of. You're literally my last hope. You're the light at the end of the tunnel. If this doesn't work, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so we become that, that last glimmer of hope for the client. But with what we do, we're able to, in a very powerful and loving way, we can change that person's life. So helplessness is when the person accepts that there may be nothing that can be done for them. Many clients, like I said, come to see me and they feel that there's nothing anybody can do for them, that they're going to die that way, that they're going to be crazy for the rest of their lives, that their functionality is just going to be hindered and there's nothing that can be done. And showing somebody their brain activity in real time is very powerful, because they then come to this point of understanding that it's not them who are deliberately causing this. Is their brains not being flexible enough to help facilitate that change. So we also work a lot with the orienting response, and we do this because clients tend to get attached, for lack of a better word, or tend to orient to their traumas. So we would think that if somebody's traumatized, they would try to get away from that. But in a way, they get sort of a Stockholm syndrome with the trauma, where they're familiar with it and they will gravitate towards that trauma, whether it's psychologically, physically, emotionally, or all three of those dimensions. Clients will gravitate and tend to move forward what traumatizes them in the first place. And normally clients do it because their brain becomes familiar with that pattern. Anything that's not related to that memory, related to that event, and the consequences of it will be dysregulating for the client. So you would think people will move away from it, but what people tend to do for a large part of the time is to gravitate towards it. So they tend to look for that tiger, that predator, that menace in the first place. And it becomes a familiar place from a physical perspective, from an emotional perspective, and from a psychological perspective. And what we need to do is to gently and steadily move the client away from that process via self-regulation or self-knowledge. Now, what happens with dysregulation is because people stop knowing who they are. They stop knowing themselves. And that's when dysregulation takes place. Self-regulation is about knowing yourself, knowing your limitations, knowing your handicaps, knowing your strengths. And when you start knowing that, and we start relearning it in a healthier way, you move towards self-regulation. Now, what we do with neuroscience is that we help that brain become flexible so that people can process that information more optimally. What happens in trauma and other forms of mental illness is that the brain becomes really rigid. The central nervous system will become very rigid. And therefore, the client will not have the ability to take in the information that the environment is providing to utilize it to his or her benefit. So when we change brainwave patterns, we are helping the CNS, the central nervous system, and the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, to become more flexible. And then the client will say, I get it now. I don't have to be angry all the time. I don't have to be resentful all the time. I don't have to be in pain. I don't have to have nightmares anymore. I don't have to constantly cry, because I know that I can get myself to that point where I know myself and I accept myself as I am, and I try to do the best that I can. And with brain spotting and looking at brain activity, that's what we do. So let's talk about some trauma and some psychophysiology. This, probably most of you are familiar with the inverted U hypothesis. This is something we use a lot in sports psychology to talk about performance. Now, whether you're talking about athletes or peak performers or just regular people like you and I, we are talking about functioning and performance. Each one of us has an individual zone of optimal functioning. Okay, we have an eyes off. And that individual zone of optimal functioning is going to depend on our arousal level. Some of us would perform better when the stakes are high, and we like the adrenaline, and we like the rush, and we like the sense of danger, and we like to flirt with it. Some of us will perform when the stakes are not so high. Some of us will prefer a more boring approach or a more dull approach to performance. Now, most of us are going to perform in the middle, when the arousal is neither too high nor too low.
Okay.
What happens in trauma?
Santiago?
Yes?
There's a request for, can you speak slower so we can more understand more?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
My apologies. So what happens in trauma is that we end up being stuck here where arousal is really high, and we're hypervigilant, we're angry, we're nervous, we are on the lookout for danger, and our relationships go out the window, or we get stuck on the low end of the equation where we are in hopelessness, we're in helplessness, and we are in dissociation. So what we do is we have to find, we attempt to find, and we work hard to find the person's ideal arousal level. And we bring them closer to the middle or the ends, depending on where they want to be and where they feel better, where they feel healthier. And that tends to be a subjective experience. And it is a subjective experience because we are unique. All of our brains are wired in a unique way. There's no two brains that are alike in the world, okay? So my brain is wired in a specific way, and your brains are wired in a specific way. And that's an advantage because it makes us unique. It makes us who we are. So we use that wiring to our advantage. We then use brain spotting or neuroscience techniques such as neurofeedback to optimize that brain connectivity. And we can then optimize your talents and your memory and your healing abilities. But that's why we want to have an assessment that looks at you as an individual. And that's why we also need to understand that your individual zone of optimal functioning is unique to you. Okay. Now, we can, one of the assessments that we can use is something we call a psychophysiological stress profile. And what we do in a stress profile is that we use non-invasive measuring techniques. So we're going to place sensors on your muscles. We're going to place sensors on the palm of your hand, on your diaphragm to measure your breathing. And we look at your respiration rate. We look at your muscle tension. We look at the heart rate. We look at your temperature, and we look at your sweating response. All of these elements are telling of your autonomic nervous system's behavior, are going to tell us whether you have more sympathetic activation and you are on the high end of the scale, or you have more parasympathetic activation and you're on the lower end of the scale. Therefore, we can move you to your self-regulation point, to your ideal performance point. Now, all of these, all of them are very important, but your body temperature and your galvanic skin conductance, meaning your sweating response, are the two most telling modalities of someone's psychological vulnerability to stress. If you're highly vulnerable to stress because of trauma or other elements, your temperature and skill conductance will provide us a lot of information in that regard. What we do is we connect somebody and we do a test for 10 minutes in 5 different stages. We start with a baseline. So you're sitting in a chair and you're relaxing and everything's well. And we assume that you are relaxed and that's how you operate normally. Then we stress you, we give you a mathematical task, which is aimed at stressing you, and we see how your body reacts to that. Then we allow you to rest for 2 minutes. We ask you to relax, to recover, because we want to see how well the individual recovers, how fast they recover. Then we stress the individual again by asking them to talk about something quite stressful or even the traumatic experience. And again, we see the increase in those physiological modalities, and then we let the client rest again. So we go from baseline to stress to recovery to stress to recovery. And then we see how their breathing, the respiration reacts, how their muscles tense up, how their heartbeat speeds up, the heart rate speeds up, if the temperature drops because they become colder, and if the hands sweat more because they get sweaty, they get anxious. And people here react in different ways. So that's why we're talking about individual assessment and individual interventions. A test like this, an assessment like this, as a brain spotter, provides me with a wealth of information, which then I can incorporate into the brain spotting intervention. So as I'm doing brain spotting, I can decide whether to do inside window, outside window, virgins, or Z-axis, or based on this information and my clinical insight, my clinical experience, and my clinical talents, which approach works better for this client based on this information. Now, this is not an exact science. It's still in its infancy, but I'm working towards, moving it to be more mainstream and more useful for all of those of us who do brain spotting and work with trauma. Now, this is the brain map of a 30-year-old who came with migraine headaches, IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. There's a sign of inflammation in his gastrointestinal system. He's 22 kilograms, about 40 pounds overweight, and has an addiction to sugar and obviously has a trauma history. And this is what his data looks like. His respiration rate is about 20 breaths per minute when it usually needs to be between 5 and 7. So he's over-breathing, almost hyperventilating. His muscle tension is at 21 microvolts in the back of the shoulders, and the ideal value is 3 to 5. So he's generating a lot of muscle tension. His basal heart rate is 80, which is okay, it's fine for normal for his age. However, we want to bring it down. His temperature is about 34 degrees Celsius, about 92 Fahrenheit, and his skin conductance 3.86, which is a little high, okay? Now, what we're seeing here is that this person is directing the sequelae from his trauma, the consequence of his trauma, into his shoulders, into his breathing, and into his sweating response. Like I said, different individuals have different reactions. And for this specific individual, his reactivity is directed to specific bodily responses. Then we can address those with brain spotting. We can find the body, the sensation on the body as we're finding the spot, located to the shoulders, located to the sweat glands, located to the diaphragm, and we can start processing from there. So this helps us hone in more specifically on body regions where the trauma is being held. It doesn't necessarily mean that that this is always directly related, but it means that it's significant. Okay? It's of significance, and we need to pay attention to it, and we need to address it when we're in the middle of an intervention or in the course of an intervention. This is a male, 45 years old, comes consulting for panic attacks. Obviously, there is inflammation. Normally, where there's trauma, there's chronic stress. Where there's chronic stress, there's inflammation. We have a lot of cortisol and cytokines and all sorts of chemicals in our system, which will cause our nervous system to become inflamed. And that's when we have a more proneness to depression and the trauma response or PTSD. Sugar addiction, highly seen in traumatized individuals. They use sugar as a way to compensate for their emotional responding. So sugar becomes emotional eating, and sugar is highly addictive and highly inflammatory. Sugar can be more dangerous than cocaine, or more addictive than cocaine, more addictive than heroin itself. So dieting becomes really important, an important part of the intervention here too. And of course, there's a trauma history in this individual. Now, if you see, his muscles are at 23. His respiration rate on average is 18 breaths per minute, minimum 5, maximum 7. So he's way over the ideal range. But what gets my attention is his galvanic skin response, his sweating response, which is at 18. And his ideal number should be at 1 or 2, 2.5 maximum. He's way over that. And his temperature is 24 Celsius, about 75, 76 maybe Fahrenheit, so it's low. What is happening here is that he's having a lot of sympathetic arousal. So his sympathetic branch is quite dominant. And we need to disengage. We need to help self-regulate this, or decouple or cool down the sympathetic branch if we want this client to get better. Because what is happening is that based on these numbers, he's stuck in sympathetic arousal. For this client, the most salient elements are going to be hypervigilance and probably dissociation. Hypervigilant individuals tend to dissociate as well. So it's a interplay in between the two. They become so overwhelmed that they go into dissociation to compensate. Now, what's in the body, it's in the brain, and what's in the brain, it's in the body. And David has said it numerous times, and it applies every time. What we're doing here is making the connection with neuroscience and technology. So we are able to see the mind-body connection. And what happens is that your sweat glands will have connections and will share connections with certain brain regions. So every time you get a sweaty hand because you're anxious, you're activating specific brain regions. And those are related to the trauma response. So it's important to first understand that your blood vessels, which control your blood flow and temperature, and your sweat glands, which cause you to sweat, sometimes profusely, are only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So in order to calm somebody down and bring down sympathetic tone, sympathetic dominance, what we need to do is engage the sympathetic branch, talk to it, negotiate with it, and then help it bring it down. And what I have found is that brain spotting is one of the best methodologies for doing that. Because when somebody's experiencing the reflexes, whether they're blinking too fast, whether their eyes are wobbling, whether they're twitching, it's that we are moving the energy through that sympathetic branch, and we're getting the info to process more efficiently. And that's one of the features that I enjoy and I love about brain spotting. Now, we are working with Mario in Spain, and we are working together into developing more research. We all know that brain spotting is powerful. I have experienced it myself. I have been a recipient of brain spotting, and it's changed my life dramatically. But what we need to know is to show why it works. So my constant obsession, if you will, is to understand the mechanisms of brain spotting. I want to understand the physiological mechanisms, the neurophysiological mechanisms, the biochemical mechanisms of brain spotting. Because if we are able to show it with research, we're gonna become an evidence-based intervention, and we're gonna gain a lot of momentum in terms of proving that this works and why it works. So my passion is to really unite and bridge the gap that there's between neuroscience and brain spotting, and that's why I do these recordings. So as I said, the sweat glands and the blood vessels are exclusively innervated by the sympathetic branch. And what happens is that when we operate from our cortex, from our neocortex, we're not able to reach that process. So that's not to say that psychotherapy is not effective, but it has its shortcomings. And one of those shortcomings is that you cannot reach the subcortical brain by just talking and operating from the neocortex. You need to go deep. And that's one of the things brain spotting does. We have hypotheses as to how it works, but we need to do more work to show that. And when we reach the subcortical brain, then we're reaching higher brain regions. Now, the brain regions involved in the trauma response, or some of the brain regions involved in the trauma response that are going to be correlating with your blood vessels and your sweat glands, are your prefrontal cortex, which is good for impulse control and thinking before we act, your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, so Broca's area on the right or the left, right about that piece of real estate, which are important for controlling anger and impulsiveness, okay? Your anterior cingulate, which is part of the limbic system, and it's going to be more into the frontal region of the brain, and your amygdala and your insula, which have to do with psychiatric conditions. So as we sweat, as our temperature drops, those areas of the brain are going to be taking turns and processing information in different ways. And what we do with brain spotting plus neuroscience is to be able to provide the physical, substantial, tangible evidence that that's the process. And we therefore go into an intervention that we deem optimal for a specific client depending on the case. So I'm not going to stop here because this is, I can happily share the article via email with Brainspotting Indonesia, and then they can distribute it to everybody. This is the paper that talks about the connection between the sweat glands and the brain areas. Now, let's talk about heart rate variability as another form of assessment and intervention. I'm going to stop a little bit more here, just checking the time, see how we're doing. So when we talk about variability, we're talking about resilience and flexibility. So variability is about resilience and flexibility, and resilience and flexibility are about empowerment. When we increase variability in the heart rhythms, we are creating a client who is more flexible and more resilient from a physical, emotional, and psychological perspective, okay? And when we have a resilient client, we have an empowered client. So neuroscience, it's one of the tools that I truly, wholeheartedly believe is going to help us make brain spotting more mainstream in the future. And it's going to provide us with that much needed substantial evidence. So Mario and I know Damir in Europe, and I know Jane in Canada, and some people around the United States are working into the same projects into providing more neuroscience evidence. So there's a bunch of us around the world doing this, and we need this. The more, the more the better. These are all fantastic, incredibly bright people, and that's what we need. So again, with brain spotting or heart rate variability, we want to increase flexibility, which at the same time increases resilience, which at the same time optimizes empowerment. And what we see is that clients are stuck in a closed loop that goes from arousal to helplessness because they cannot escape, to experiencing fear and helplessness and depression and anxiety, to becoming immobile and helpless and frozen and starting over again. And with this, with the assessment plus the intervention, we break that cycle and we allow the client to be from being victimized to being empowered. And empowerment equals self-regulation equals flexibility. So the way I see it, from my perspective, from the little research that I've done and my work, is that empowerment is key. And empowerment means self-regulation, means knowing yourself and knowing that you can control and you can react properly and that you no longer have to be a victim anymore. Now, when we are talking about heart rate variability, I'm talking about heart rhythmicity and how heart rhythmicity will influence brain regions through the vagus nerve. So the same brain regions will be affected negatively by poor heart rhythmicity or unhealthy heart rhythmicity. And those same brain regions will be positively impacted by healthy, coherent heart rhythmicity. Some of you know about heart rate variability. Some of you are probably hearing about it for the first time. I strongly recommend that even if you are a very successful and very experienced brain spotting practitioner, you include heart rate variability as an adjunct to your interventions, because it is a very powerful, low-cost, cost-efficient technique, okay? And you will only strengthen your brain spotting interventions. It's not antagonic to brain spotting. It's an adjunct. It's a reinforcer to the brain spotting experience. I use it all the time before a brain spotting session, after a brain spotting session, in between brain spotting sessions. And it works wonderfully. And let's see why it works. The relay point, the liaison between your heart and your brain is the vagus nerve. Okay, and a lot of you have studied the polyvagal theory, and some of the elements of the polyvagal theory are going to be related to what we do with heart rate variability. Now, we influence via the vagus nerves specific regions of the brain. The medulla, which controls our breathing rate and the amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, that we expel. So respiration is all about gas exchange, and when gas exchange is not optimal, when it's not balanced, we can further dive into the trauma response, and we're stuck in sympathetic or parasympathetic arousal. So understanding gas exchange is important. And there's an area of the brainstem, which is the medulla, and it's right around here. We have some structures called chemoreceptors, and those chemoreceptors are the structures of the brain that signals us to breathe. So when I breathe in, I breathe out and exhale, I have finished expelling some CO2. This chemoreceptors are going to go, Santiago, you need to inhale again, otherwise you're not going to breathe anymore and you're going to die. So chemoreceptors signal other centers of the brain for me to breathe again. And as I breathe out, those chemoreceptors are going to continuously signal me. The problem is that when we either overbreathe, we breathe too fast, or we hyperventilate, we are programming those chemoreceptors to accept and understand and see the current breathing rate as normal. So if my breathing rate is 20, when my ideal is 5 to 7, my chemoreceptors are going to think that breathing at 20 breaths per minute or more, it's okay, when in fact it's not. So when we teach, when we make that breathing volitional and conscious, we are reprogramming those chemoreceptors. And when we reprogram the chemoreceptors, what we are doing is teaching healthier breathing. Heart rhythmicity will slow down and the brain will get a different message. Now we go into the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain of extreme importance, because the hippocampus is where we make new neurons. That's our neurogenesis center, all right? That's where we manufacture new neurons from the moment we're born to the moment we pass away. And it's also important because our biographical memory, it's largely stored in the hippocampus. So our life history is largely stored in the hippocampus, which is part of the limbic system. And the hippocampus, it's also important because that's where memory and learning are consolidated. So learning and memory consolidation come from the hippocampus, and a lot of the theta brain waves, which are related to learning and memory, are produced by neurons in the hippocampus. So the theta rhythm. And you probably have seen in your experience that highly or severely systematically traumatized clients will have a lot of memory issues. That's because our adrenal glands are going to make a lot of cortisol. The cortisol is going to travel to the brain, is going to go through the blood-brain barrier, and is going to go and bind into the hippocampus. And what cortisol does is it kills neurons. So every time you are activating your chronic stress response, you're overactivating your Hpa axis. And every time you're producing a lot of cortisol, you are killing neurons. Memory and learning go out the window. Everything becomes more overwhelming from a physical, psychological, or emotional perspective. Now, we need to take care of the hippocampus because of that reason. Now, when there's when there's evil, there's good in the universe. So there's always a yin and a yang, and there's balance. The hippocampus has a good thing. It produces a substance called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's a growth factor that's secreted with movement, and it's secreted with relaxation. The main way you secrete BDNF is through movement or physical exercise, the best proven way. But meditating or self-regulation helps secrete BDNF in smaller amounts, okay? And BDNF is the growth factor that allows you to grow new and healthy neurons that will, travel and migrate to other areas of the brain and will be binding to those regions of the brain by something called Gliac cells. So Gliac cells help support and keep things in play. They act like a glue, but they also have other functions. So when we sprout and we manufacture new neurons, we're making them in the hippocampus, and they migrate, and the glia will help them bind and stay there. And the BDNF is also a cortisol buster. So BDNF neutralizes the effects of cortisol. So exercising, eating well, and getting mental help from a qualified professional will help protect the hippocampus. Now, we also influence the amygdala, which is emotional responding. And this is part of the mammalian and reptilian brains, our more primitive brains. When we react instinctively to survive, is these areas that are getting activated. The amygdala shares connections with your prefrontal cortex. Okay, so we have connections that go from the frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex all the way to the limbic system and hippocampus, amygdala, etc. And this is a bi-directional relationship. They influence one another. When we have overactivation of your limbic region, your frontal cortex shuts down. and you act more instinctively. So it's the war veteran whose wife is sneaking up on him because she's playing a joke on him, and he reacts by grabbing her and choking her because he thinks it's a terrorist trying to kill him. That's the limbic system being overactive. And that's the prefrontal cortex losing blood flow, and you react more instinctively, okay? It's a fight or flight mechanism. Now, when you self-regulate and you optimize brain rhythmicity, what you're doing then is that you are reducing excessive blood flow to, or hyperperfusion to the amygdala and the hippocampus, and you are optimizing blood flow into the frontal cortex, and you can react more accordingly. You think before you do, okay? So by optimizing heart rhythmicity and measuring it, we can detect how the limbic system, the neocortex, the medulla, the hippocampus, and the frontal cortex are operating. So by looking at the brain and the psychophysiological responding, we can gather very good information and generate very good useful hypotheses as to why and how we need to intervene. Now, we look at the EEG, and one of the elements that I have is I have this very nice amplifier that helps me record EEG activity, which are these lines that you see going up and down, and EKG or heart activity. So I can record the heart and the brain at the same time. And I can do this while I'm doing brain spotting with somebody. I can do this while I am doing EMDR with somebody. I can do this while I'm doing hypnosis with somebody. So I can see how the heart and the brain are interacting with this technology. And this is very, very useful for us because it's going to give us clues as to how that relationship is taking place in that individual's organism, and how we can then provide them with the appropriate set of interventions that are going to help them heal and move on. So I want to show you this slide here because this is a recording from a person who has a history of trauma. This is a male who's 35 years old and has a history of several traumas going back to infancy and in his teenage years. So adolescence and infancy were quite stressful, traumatic periods for him. And we are recording a baseline. So we are not doing anything, only assessment. This is his brain activity. This is his heart activity. Here you can see this pattern that goes up and down, and this is new brain waves, and new brain waves correlate with trauma, dissociation more specifically. So this is a client who dissociates. And if you look at the back of the brain, this is PZ, and PZ is this region of the brain, the parietal cortex, which is important for self-regulation. So the area of the brain that greatly allows us to self-regulate, it's the parietal cortex. And he's not making a lot of alpha brainwaves. Alpha brainwaves are good for self-regulation. And he's not having any alpha brainwaves. So the lack of alpha brainwaves, it's related to this darker gray, which is his sympathetic branch. So hyperarousal, hypervigilance. And the mu is correlating with the parasympathetic branch kicking in. So this is an individual who is highly anxious and dissociates. And this is the visual representation of the mu. So this is the mu brainwave, and the peak represents the power. The higher the peak, the more problematic this is. And the more red we see, the more problematic. This is the central sensory motor strip. So it would be this region of the brain, our sensory motor cortex. If we look at it this way, it's the sensory motor strip. And that's part of the mirror neuron system. So mu is a dysregulation of mirror neurons, dissociation. So the higher the peak, the more red, the more problematic. So just bookmark, take a mental picture of this slide. As we move on, it will be significant. This is me then connecting the individual to the EEG and the EKG, so looking at brain activity and heart activity, and I'm teaching him how to breathe. So we're doing heart rate variability. In the green box, you can see the mu, the dissociation. And then he starts breathing at five breaths per minute, and look at how the mu desynchronizes or breaks away. And look at how lower the peak gets. It was higher here and lower here. And we also have more red here, and we have less red here. So we are accessing that mirror neural system by regulating heart rhythmicity, and we're breaking away the dissociation. I can then use brain spotting to bring this client back to the here and now, further break away the dissociation, and help them move on. But, and we know this because we're recording it. So this is evidence that it works. And it's the initial step into understanding the mechanisms, which is what I really want to understand. I really want to understand mechanisms behind brain spotting and help you guys out there understand them so we can become better practitioners. Now, this is the brain activity of somebody with anxiety. I haven't done any brain spotting here, but I want to show you how heart rate variability helps brain activity. Just the mere process of breathing in a specific way will change brain activity dramatically. We have lots of yellow peaks, which are fast alpha brainwaves, and light blue and green peaks, which are beta brainwaves. These are fast brainwaves, which relate to anxiety. And you can see the amplitude here. The peaks are high. And if you notice down here, the anterior cingulate cortex for this individual is really active. When it's red, it means it's really active. So this is somebody who's fretting and rumination and intrusive thoughts. I teach him how to breathe, and I ask him to breathe at 7 breaths per minute, and look at the changes. Look at the reduction in the peaks, look at the reduction in the amplitude, and look at the reduction in the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex. I mean, it's fantastic, it's wonderful. Just by breathing for 5 minutes, it's already influencing the brain in a positive way. So if you have a brain spotting client, you do this wonderful session, they process and they go deep into the subcortical brain and they stay there, and then you teach them how to do heart rate variability in between sessions, you are going to have a winning formula because you're strengthening that process and you're in no way interfering with what the brain is doing in terms of processing. You are using an additional tool that's going to help the processing become more profound and even more meaningful for the client. Then I ask him to breathe at 6.5 breaths per minute. And again, a reduction in the peaks, a reduction in amplitude, and a reduction in anterior cingulate cortex activation. So what I could do is then I can go and do brain spotting with this individual, targeting this area of the brain via either an activating spot or a resourcing spot, and boom, we're there. You know, we're driving the client home. Then he breathes even slower, 6 breaths per minute. And if you notice, there was an increase in brain activity, meaning 6 breaths per minute, it's very slow for this client. So we're also seeing what the ideal breathing rate for the client is based on their brain activity. I'm not making this up. I'm not playing it by ear. I'm looking at it from concrete evidence. This is the pre and the post, and these are pictures of the subcortical brain using a software called Loretta, low resolution tomographies. Okay, it's the poor people's or the poor man's MRI. So it's not quite as crisp as an advanced as an MRI, but it provides us with useful information. This is the before the breathing. This is after the breathing. More red is more problematic. Less red or fewer red spots means less problematic, a better functioning brain. Look at before, look at after, more red here and less red here, and no red here, more red here in the back of the head, this being the cerebellum, and this would be the self-regulation region of the brain, a lot less red, and the same here. So we're measuring what it does. And I'm going to show you later on how we did it with Brainspotting. So let's talk about brain maps and brain activity and trauma now. To understand how the brain works and the EEG, I'm going to explain two very basic concepts. Brain waves. The brain makes two types of brain waves, slow and fast. And those brain waves have two characteristics. The frequency, which is the speed, and we measure that in hertz. And the amplitude, which is related to power, and it's measured in microvolts. So amplitude has to do with the size of the brain wave, and speed has to do with this, and frequency is the number of cycles per second, the number of peaks per second. Here we have 1 second in between these two lines, and we have 1 cycle and 2 cycles per second. 2 cycles per second means 2 hertz. That's the speed of the brain. And those brain wave patterns are associated to the components of trauma. They're associated and correlated with hyperarousal, with hypoarousal, or dissociation, helplessness, hypervigilance, constriction, and so on and so forth. So we're being able to draw more and more correlates of those brainwave patterns and what it means to the brain in terms of the trauma response. And we give names to those frequencies, to those brainwaves. Delta goes from 0 to 4 hertz, theta brainwaves between 4 and 8 hertz, alpha brainwaves between 8 and 12 hertz, mu brainwaves between 8 to 10, 10 to 12 hertz, SMR, sensory motor rhythm, 12 to 15, beta brainwaves, 13 to 21, high beta brainwaves, 20 to 35, and gamma brainwaves between 35 and 100 hertz. So these are the different classifications we have for brain waves. Now, when you have a high amplitude brainwave, when the wave is really high, it means it's slow. When the brainwave is small, it means it's fast. So the higher the amplitude, the bigger the brainwave, the slower it is. The smaller the brainwave, the faster it is. And that has to do with arousal. That's very important. Now, just bear with me and try to follow me to the best of your ability. This is not a neuroscience profound class. I'm just trying to, as succinctly as possible, to explain the process behind this.